vertically challenged I am. So we're going to have a little bit of a shift now from the opinions, speculations of the first two panels, and we are going to see the actual impact and devastation that this war has created in Ukraine. Since the invasion of the war in 2022, all of the headlines have focused on the immediate medical and humanitarian needs of the attacked residents and military populations. The diaspora, as well as the Ukrainian Medical Association, who we are part of, responded quickly, supplying healthcare, supplies, equipment, medication. Often overlooked, however, is the silent aspect of the war's long-term impact and effect on the populace and the environment. The destruction of farmland, the forests, deadly pollution, water, air, and inevitably just the loss of ecosystem. I'd like to introduce our two esteemed and expert speakers. I am a primary care physician, not an academic, so I defer to them in a lot of their truly knowledge of the situation. I am happy to hear all of the glowing compliments about Chicago, being a native Chicagoan, and I'm happy that our speakers both trained in Illinois, and we do forgive Dr. Erickson for heading out to Harvard, but maybe he taught him something he learned at Cook County here. So, Dr. Hryhorczuk, Daniel, is known to the Ukrainian community as Danko, and Danko has worked in occupational environmental health in the US and in Ukraine for years. In the US, he's worked on the Great Lakes. In Ukraine, he's worked on the Chernivtsi chemical illness health project and the Chernobyl nuclear reactor catastrophe. He has, since the independence of Ukraine, has been involved in many occupational and toxicology projects. He is a member of the Ukrainian Academy of Medical Sciences. Dr. Erickson is an emergency room medicine physician and an expert in humanitarian health, environmental toxicology, water waste problems, something I was not familiar with, CBRNE, chemical, biological, radiologic, nuclear, and explosive terrorism, which is all something that is happening in Ukraine, along with injuries and global and disasters. So I would like to introduce them. They are going to each present their versions of what is going on in Ukraine right now. Dr. Hryhorczuk first.
Okay. Thank you, Marika. So I'll be speaking about the environmental health impacts of the war, of Russia's war in Ukraine. Before I talk about the environmental health impacts, I'd like to start with the human toll. There have been over 1 million military casualties, tens of thousands of civilian casualties. Almost 7 million people have fled Ukraine. 3.5 million have been internally displaced. And the poverty rate increased from about 5.5% to 24.5%. So the human toll has been huge, and it keeps increasing every day. When we talk about the environment, we talk about the built environment, the things that we humans build, houses, bridges, roads, and also about the natural environment. I'll be talking mainly about the natural environment, but most of the focus today has gone on the damage to the built environment. And just to summarize it here, from the KF School of Economics, as of last November, about 236,000 destroyed residential buildings, 26,000 kilometers of roads, hundreds of industries, about 4,000 schools, almost 1,500 medical facilities and hospitals, 4,000 cultural sites. Why the Russians are trying to destroy Ukraine's cultural identity. In terms of the natural environment, here you have a map of Ukraine showing where the invasion is occurring. The areas in red are where Russia has invaded. And the areas in red are where most of the damage has occurred. And most of the damage that's currently ongoing is along that contact line where the two forces have met. That's where where millions of shells are flying overhead, millions of drones are flying overhead. This is going to be the most contaminated area. It's estimated by the Ukraine's Ministry of Environment that there's been up to $85 million of damage to the environment alone from the ongoing war. In terms of air pollution, you get air pollution from the explosives, from the fires that result when these bombs blow up, from wildfires, which is a big problem, from oil fires. Oil is being intentionally targeted by both sides, from building and demolition debris, from toxic releases when these missiles hit factories or hit storage sites, and exhaust from military transport. On the other hand, people argue, well, maybe there's less pollution because industry has fallen down, there's much less transportation. When we look at the net effect is actually an increase in pollution, primarily in greenhouse gases. And also in particulates. These are very fine particulates, the kinds of things that cause cardiovascular disease and lung cancer. And finally, as I mentioned here, on the right you have a picture of a nitric acid plume when a storage facility was hit by a missile. And that's a highly toxic gas that will pretty much kill you if you come into contact with it. So these are the kinds of air pollutants that Ukraine is currently suffering from. Another huge problem are conflict-related fires. When a missile or a drone hits a wood, the woods catch on fire. The total surface area of fires in Ukrainian forests has increased 100 times since 2022. A huge increase in forest fires. We have our own experience with forest fires here in the United States. We know how devastating those can be. They're a complex mixture of gases, aerosols, and there's even been fires in the Chernobyl exclusion zone and in protected areas like the Kilburn Peninsula. Another big source of pollution, of air pollution, is conflict rubble. You know, we saw when the World Trade Center collapsed, all of the material that went up in the air, asbestos, PVCs, alkaline dust. This is happening daily in Ukraine. These buildings are getting destroyed, these dusts are going up in the air, and they're a problem not only when you're there and it blows up, when time comes to clean it all up, it's going to be huge exposure to those people who are trying to clean that up. In terms of water, in 2022, shortly after the war began, United Nations estimated that 16 million people in Ukraine needed assistance with water, sanitation, or hygiene. Currently, that number has come down to about 6 million Ukrainians who have limited or no access to clean water. Much of that was done when the Russians blew up the Kakhovka Dam. And by blowing up that dam, they just destroyed about 1/3 of Ukraine's fresh water storage capacity that's also used for drinking and for irrigation. This just shows you the extent of the devastation to the water and sewage networks. I mean, almost 2,000 linear kilometers of water supply networks, treatment facilities, water pumping stations, wells. In terms of sanitation infrastructure, almost 500 kilometers of sewage lines. I mean, completely destroying our water and sewage infrastructure. That results in people's lack of access to water, period, but also lack of access to clean water, and the water you get could be highly contaminated. So how's it contaminated? Contaminated with sewage, because we're not handling the wastewater. contaminated from chemical spills when you blow up the factories and storage sites, contaminated too with unexploded ordnance, and Dr. Erickson will be talking about that. When you shoot these missiles and artillery shells and drones, they don't all blow up. Depending on who made them and how long ago, 30% of them might not blow up, which means they're in the environment waiting to blow up some future day, or else leaking their materials out into the environment. The rivers are also contaminated with dead bodies, with dead livestock, and fish kills, and there's also contamination from mining waste that I'll get into in a moment. So a little known fact is that 2/3 of the mines in Ukraine have been either destroyed or damaged due to the result of military action. When you dig a mine, water starts seeping in there. Unless you pump the water out, whatever's in the mine could get into that water. Well, it turns out that there's a mine in Donetsk called Unikomunal mine that was the site of a nuclear detonation, a controlled one, in 1979 that's still filled with radioactive waste. And that radioactive waste could come back and contaminate the surface water. In addition, in the same area, there are mines in Hryhorczuk used to store chemical waste like chlorobenzene and other toxins. So the fact that we're not pumping the water out of these mines is an ongoing hazard. In terms of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov and coastal areas, they've been also heavily impacted by bombardment, by marine mines, oil spills. There have been reports of dolphin deaths from all the sonar that's being used. The biggest issue was the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but about 4.4 billion cubic meters of water carrying sediment and debris spilled out into the Black Sea. Another hazard is Russia is using a lot of illegal ships to carry both grain and oil, and these ships have ballast that can put exotic organisms back into the Black Sea. In terms of the soil, when we think of soil, we think of dirt. The soil is not just dirt. Soil is a living ecosystem. It can take thousands of years to generate good soil, and Ukraine has some of the richest soil in the world. With what's called chornozem. About 25% of the world's chornozem is in Ukraine, which is why it's such a rich agricultural area. That's getting destroyed by these heavy machines going through it, by bombs blowing up in it. You get this landscape and habitat destruction, again, through the passage of heavy vehicles compressing, compacting that soil, through digging trenches and bunkers, which are all along the contact line. In about 30% of Ukraine's protected areas. Prior to the war, about 7% of Ukraine was set aside as a naturally protected area. So these have been polluted by military maneuvers. Ukraine is part of what was called the Green Heart of Europe, part of the Emerald Network, which means that it has specialized ecosystems that you only find in certain places in Europe, especially here in Ukraine. As I said before, up to 7% of Ukraine was set aside as protected areas. And since the war, 40% of these have been invaded, and there have been at least 2,000 instances of destruction of wildlife and ecosystem. And some of the animals, like the steppe eagle, black stork, and others, are on the verge of extinction. Radiation is a huge concern. Radiation could be a problem from a takeover of a power plant, like we've seen with Zaporizhzhia. There was damage to a radiation research facility in Kharkiv. The Russians hit it with a missile. There have been wildfires in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. I mentioned the Yukon coal mine. And the unthinkable would be use of a tactical nuclear weapon, which has been threatened. I hope that never happens, but that would be an existential threat if that gets out of control. Ukraine has currently 4 nuclear power plants, which before the war accounted for about 50% of Ukraine's electrical power. So Ukraine is very dependent on nuclear power plants. And as you know, it's the home to the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. On March 4th, just when the war began, Russia occupied the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is specifically prohibited by the 1977 amendments to the Geneva Convention. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant has been shelled. There are holes in some of the roofs. They kidnapped the director and the deputy director. They placed heavy weapons on the site. They stored ammunition on the site. It was a huge problem until the International Atomic Agency was able to to go in and put their own inspectors in. Is it still a potential problem? Yes, it is, for the following reason. Someone asked me, could we have a Chernobyl happen at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant? Not a Chernobyl, we could have a Fukushima-like accident. Chernobyl happened because Chernobyl had no concrete containment, whereas these power plants do. Chernobyl had graphite as a moderator, which burned. These are light water reactors like we have in the United States. So these are very much Western-style, Fukushima-like reactors. What could happen here? Even when the reactor is shut down, that nuclear waste is hot, and you got to cool it down by pumping water to it. If you stop pumping water to it, like you have a disruption of electricity, which has happened a couple of times, but a prolonged disruption of electricity would cause the reactors to start melting down. You'd have then an inside hydrogen explosion, you'd have a blow up, you'd have a Fukushima-like accident. And a simulation showed that happened on the right. Over about 2 million square kilometers would be affected, affecting 1 million people. So it's a huge problem, potential problem against the Geneva Convention, and we're hoping that never happens. And I know some of the training that Tim has been doing is specifically around that particular reactor site. Finally, if I were to name one single event that could constitute maybe a war crime, it would be the Russians blowing up the Kakhovka Dam in June 6th of 2023. That dam, the Dnipro River has a system of dams and reservoirs as the river goes down to the Black Sea that provides Ukraine with much of its drinking water and irrigation. The Russians blew up the lowest part of that dam, the Kakhovka Dam, resulting in a flooding of about 77 settlements. Again, almost 20 billion cubic meters of water were released. Just some pictures from that. On the right, you see an algae bloom in the Black Sea resulting from all the sediment from the Kakhovka Dam being released into the Black Sea. And the long-term impacts, it will take, I don't know if the dam will ever be rebuilt. 700,000 people were left without water, a lot of area left without irrigation, 14% reduction in Ukraine grain imports. Finally, Russia's war in Ukraine has impacted not just Ukraine, it's impacting the entire world. It's cost the global economy about 1.5% of global GDP and keeps going, which is trillions of dollars of lost global output. Result in energy crisis, food insecurity. Ukraine supplied food to about 400 million people in the global south. It caused inflationary pressures, supply chain disruptions, and think of it, how many trillions of dollars were lost that could have been spent, diverted from fighting to be spent on things like poverty, famine, climate change. So these are resources that are unfortunately being directed towards war instead. And finally, this war will end, and I'm confident it will end with Ukrainian victory, but the post-war reconstruction will be a monumental task. World Bank estimates it'll cost about $350 billion to begin to rebuild Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is thinking forward about this. They've set up a National Council for Recovery of the War, and the good news is that they're planning to rebuild Ukraine in a green and sustainable manner. Ukraine used to be very old Soviet fossil fuel, heavily polluting kind of industry. Now they have a chance to rebuild it, unfortunately, from scratch into a green, sustainable economy. So that's our ultimate goal, is not just, is actually to make it hopefully better than it was in terms of a sustainable economy. Okay, with that, I'll conclude my remarks and turn it over to Tim. Thank you.
Dobro ranku. It's still morning, right? Yeah, never be the one speaker that sits in front of the audience in their lunch, particularly if they're Ukrainian. So if we could pull up my presentation, that would be fantastic. But it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be back in Ukrainian Village. I lived in this area when I was at Cook County and UIC. I'm a proud Chicagoan, and the city of broad shoulders will always be my hometown. Boston's been great, but it's not Chicago. It's not the tapestry of the blending of cultures, and I'm so proud of Ukrainian Village, and what a brilliant idea to have the conference here. Okay. There it is. Great. So we'll go through a lot of information here. Thank you for the introductions. Been going back to Ukraine for a number of years when I was living in Ukrainian Village. This is in some of the post-Chernobyl work that Dr. Hryhorczuk and I did with the Family and Children of Ukraine project for those exposed to the radiation, bone marrow transplant programs with our colleague Damiano Rondelli, Mykola Prodonchik, who's one of the finest toxicologists in the world, Ukrainian, and still there. So we've been doing work for decades in Ukraine. We've done a lot with NATO. NATO's been mentioned a lot this morning. I'm glad. I do feel that Ukraine needs to be a part of NATO. We've done NATO work. In fact, our projects with NATO in 2018, 2019, 2020 were the farthest east post World War II. And we did science and peace security programs. We did countermeasure for CBRN, which is chemical, biologic, radiologic, and nuclear, advancing technologies. And right before COVID, we were in Dnipro. We had a whole session, and there was a bunch of 20-plus-year-old Ukrainians who were flying drones around saying, this is the new technology. This is what's going to be used in security, conflict, and warfare, and you better get used to it. And the organizers said, we'll give you a session at the end of the conference because we don't think this is really going to have teeth. Well, fast forward, and David Cherachenko and his expertise, you can see why drones are so important. The latest project we've had, and I'll briefly cover what we've been doing with some of our projects since the start of the illegal invasion in February of 2022 of Russia into Ukraine and through current day, is sessions in training, and not just in chemical, biologic, radiologic, nuclear, and of course explosive, which I helped oversee, but advanced trauma life support. And the Ukrainian soldiers and surgeons and physicians are now the authoritative, most talented, knowledgeable in the world. And people will come to Ukraine to learn how to treat trauma, not to the US, not to the UK. Trauma nursing fundamentals, paramedics, true heroes in this conflict and war, mass casualty events, stop the bleed. So many civilians and well-meaning people in Ukraine wanted to help in any way they can. Well, you can help by applying tourniquets on bleeding extremities to save lives. And of course, our future, our children, pediatric work. So during this time, I won't go through everything we've done, but we've made many, many trips back and forth. They actually call me an old coin in Ukraine, like a bad penny. I keep coming back. And they say, you keep coming back, and that builds trust. We've gone all over Ukraine, and some of the cities we've gone to have been under conflict. I have a soft spot in my heart for Odessa, the pearl of the Black Sea. My maternal grandfather was born in Odessa, so my father's Norwegian, but I have a gallon of blue blood on my mother's side. He was a limestone quarryman who actually had a farm outside of Odessa. There was no train stop for that little farm, so he would literally jump off the train while it was moving to go take care of his crops. So Ukrainians are tough, and I'm proud to have some of that heritage in my blood as well. So some of the challenges going in and developing these types of programs is, first you have to translate it into Ukrainian, not Russian, Ukrainian, and you have to involve the Ukrainians in giving and designing the courses. And the supply chain was already hindered by COVID. And we had to get supplies in that weren't available in Ukraine because of the war, and that was a challenge. And then getting to some of these cities from a security standpoint, and we worked with International Medical Corps to do that securely. Plus recruiting instructors who were involved in the war, who were working, who had families. Equipment was difficult to get, and what we found is we had to go on the cheap. We had to go low resource. It didn't have all the buzzers and bells that we have in the US, and actually it was better. We were able to get more of it. It was more sustainable, and we found that you can do this with a low budget. And getting it across the borders was very, very difficult, so we had to mule a lot of this. And I know people in the crowd here, I know Danko, your family has been involved in moving medical equipment and supplies into Ukraine. We wanted our scenarios to be real world threats, not just ones trained in the US, UK, and Europe, but ones that Ukraine is going to face, and involving our Ukrainians in these as well. The simulations were based on training and drills and real-time Ukrainian translation, and most importantly, Ukrainian instructors, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Without the Ukrainian instructors doing it for themselves, it would not sustain. And right now, as I speak, I can't be there, our Ukrainians are carrying on all these trainings. And they're doing it better because they don't need to translate. They're doing it in half the time, and they're doing it better than I would have ever done it or my colleagues would have ever done it. Fortunately, the triage system was color-coded, so this worked quite well. They were already using this in Ukraine with mass casualty, disaster, and trauma as we color-code victims, because unfortunately, like in this war, you cannot save everyone, and you have to put resources towards the critically ill that you may salvage, and the ones that are near dead, you cannot take the time and resources, nor can you take a lot of time with those that are walking wounded, hysterical, anxious, understandably so, separated from their children and family. You cannot spend the resources on there. So we did a lot with chemicals. I'm not going to go through this chart, but we looked at weaponized opioids, which was a real threat. Nerve agents. I know we have colleagues from Syria here. We did a lot of work in Syria with nerve agents and chlorine, so we knew this was a real threat, as well as biologicals and radiation, as Dr. Hryhorczuk mentioned. I'll just go over a couple of very brief scenarios so you get an idea. These were all done real time with Ukrainian consultation. Could it really happen? Maybe it did happen. It's a threat. This was in Kharkiv with an explosion at an industrial plant. Everything was done again in Ukrainian. I'm leaving these in English. I know a lot of you can understand both languages very well, but there are hundreds of victims coming. All of them are symptomatic in different stages, and they have to be triaged, and there may be 100 victims and only 5 or 10 healthcare providers, and you have to really rally your resources. So we focused on chemical, yes, but also agents that have been used. In Syria, sarin was used in the nerve agents. But there's a new generation, the Novichok agents, which was developed in Russia, which have been used. They're still being used. In fact, this week I've been consulted on a Novichok case. It's classified. I can't share any details. But this is being used this week, today. These are powerful, deadly nerve agents that are used in espionage, assassination, and warfare. So the training was to use auto-ejectors and get antidotes in a timely fashion. When we were training, something came about that I did not expect. White phosphorus was a threat, was a chemical threat. And again, we responded to this by developing drills. Our colleagues in Kharkiv and Dnipro said they were getting wounds from soldiers that were smoking, smoldering, days, even weeks after the wound. And the Russians have been using white phosphorus. We did not expect this, but we had to turn our training towards white phosphorus. In World War I, we know that chlorine was used extensively. It was meant to incapacitate soldiers so they couldn't fight. But in World War I, they used in the trenches so much chlorine, they were massive deaths, as too in the Syrian war. Chlorine, as we know, it's heavier than air. It sinks into buildings, and in the hospitals in Syria and Aleppo, which were underground to be out of the way of enemy fire, the chlorine gas seeps deep into the building, underground. Everyone has to evacuate, including patients, and then they come back and use secondary fire. And we've seen this in the Ukraine-Russian war. As soon as you evacuate, that's when the second wave of artillery comes in. And they're targeting healthcare workers who are neutral. And we're seeing this, of course, in Gaza right now as well. So this is a scenario with chlorine gas. And one thing we didn't expect was cypropicrine, which was an old World War I chemical warfare, which has been now used in the Russian invasion. One of the scenarios that was very important, because this was a real possibility, was weaponized opioids. Now, I know in the US, we have a heroin and a fentanyl and opioid epidemic, but these are weaponized opioids that are much more powerful, even 1,000 times more powerful than we're used to seeing, with mass casualties. And these scenarios were so real, we had translators and instructors and victims from Mariupol who had to leave the drill because they said it reminded them too much of what the trauma they went through there. We had to be sensitive to those that had post-traumatic stress disorder, both in conflict and exposure. We talked about how to use naloxone, and again, fentanyl, much more powerful than opioids. And we know with the Chechenian rebels in the early 2000s, Russians, and Putin was behind this, using weaponized opioids to try to go after Chechenian rebels, and tragically the hostages also succumbed and were not resuscitated. Victims, hands-on, it isn't enough to teach, just using slides and talking to people. You had to get people up. We used many scenarios with car bombs, and with CBRN events, explosions, blast injuries were a real scenario. So with every exposure you have, you probably have a traumatic injury. That's why advanced trauma life support teaching was so critical. The wounds here, tourniquet application became very important. We had people from the police, security, metro workers in Kyiv, scientists, teachers wanting to help. They could have left Ukraine. The women of Ukraine, true heroes, they could have left, they stayed. They stayed with their children. They came to these trainings. Young and old alike wanted to help. And of course, we were never turning anyone away. All our trainings, standing room only. They came early, they stayed late. Now they're our instructors. They're the true heroes. Dr. Hryhorczuk talked about radiation exposure, so we also did that with dosimeters and detection, making sure we're deconning patients properly. And getting dosimeters across the Ukrainian borders was interesting. As I crossed in Romania, Moldova, and Poland, I was stopped many times and many things went off. And they were accusing us of dual use. These could be used for good, evil, enemy, or Ukrainian. Dr. Hryhorczuk did a beautiful job talking about Zaporizhzhia, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, and why it was so important. We did drills there, and every time we did a drill, we asked the area, what do you want to hear? In Odessa, they wanted more about biologicals because of everything coming from Africa with the grain exportation. Obviously, in Zaporizhzhia, they wanted to talk about nuclear radiation. And so we did that, and we did many radiation drills, and most of them at night to make it real a live scenario. New technologies, this gentleman there demonstrating some of the new technologies right over by Dr. Hryhorczuk. Before the war, he was actually in green energy and doing a lot with Ukraine green energy and environmental safe, and he became a paramedic. Story after story of people that switched jobs to become a paramedic, a first responder, anything to help. We spent a lot of time with bomb threats. This was a daily occurrence. We had these, And many of the Ukrainians said, well, this happens every day. And of course, we would take these seriously. Some were very legit. Some were sounded off all over Ukraine. We continued our teachings in the bomb shelters. The students and trainers could have left, but they decided to stay. And we continued that. In fact, I was in Lviv in December, and we had a bomb threat that was very legit. It was one of the larger Russian attacks to that point. And I spent 3.5 hours in a very small bomb shelter with the Minister of Health of Ukraine and got to know him quite well. And he's a really good person. And I'm really pleased with the ministry and the young, intelligent, energetic people they're putting in these important positions, that they really are going to make a better, stronger, successful Ukraine looking ahead to the future. We were always under threat. This is a hotel room we were at in Dnipro, so we had to take precautions, have evacuation plans. And like the color code system, the hospitals there are doing the best they can. This is outside of Zaporizhia. They don't have many resources, but they're trying standardization. Outside of Zaporizhia, this is probably the biggest threat for a CBRN nuclear radiologic event, and this is the decontamination unit they have. It's basically a shower with a curtain. It isn't because they don't know what to do, they don't have the equipment. We're being told that equipment's coming from Germany, the US, the UK, from France, but we don't know where it is or where it's going to. And hospitals that take on both civilian and military casualties don't have the equipment. And here is, again, some of the decontamination equipment. And environmentally, what's very concerning, the runoff basically goes behind the hospital into the back grass. Again, they know the environmental contaminants, but they just don't have any other facilities. So we need to get the equipment in. Very briefly, this has had a big impact across Ukraine, and I'm proud to say that Ukrainians now lead the way in this training. They will train other people, bordering countries of Ukraine, all over Europe, and in low-resource areas in conflict. They'll come to Ukraine. We've worked with YouTube to make very brief YouTube videos, 2 to 3 minutes, all in Ukraine, on how to respond to trauma, to casualties, evacuation, chemicals, and there's been over 1 million hits on these. Again, all in Ukraine, and YouTube has been really quite a partner. We leave decon units behind every time we do a training. This is in Lviv. You can see it's in the winter. We had volunteers who are willing to get wet. With the cold, with the wet, the lack of water, we do a lot of dry deconning. But these decon units, when you buy them in the United States, they cost $50,000, $60,000 with all the buzzers and bells. This is about $8,000, made in Ukraine. I can tell you it is stronger, it is better, it is more efficient. We leave one of these behind every time we do a training, made by Ukraine, better in Ukraine, and Ukraine is now going to be building these for other countries. So it's a source of pride for them. Yeah. And they said, what do you think, Dr. Erickson? What do you think? I said, too much red, more yellow, more blue, was my comment. So the master instructors are the true heroes. They train, they're compassionate about this. Some of them are highly accomplished neurosurgeons, trauma surgeons, pediatricians, primary care. They've devoted themselves to this for very little pay. We were sponsored for a long time by USAID. No surprise that funding's been cut in January, and many Ukrainians lost their job. That's the thing that hurts me the most. Our friends that had work, they were doing good work. Many of them have volunteered for the front line since. Many of them are demining, but it's sustainable because of them. Very briefly, you have to publish what you do. It isn't enough to say, we did this, we did some good, we hope we didn't cause harm, we hope we left things better, but you have to publish. And of all these articles, and I won't go through them all, go back here, they all have Ukrainian authors. So The US, and rightly so, has been accused of data grabbing, going into other countries, using the data and publishing. We won't do that. There's Ukrainians on every one of these publications, and I'm very proud of that, and Dr. Hryhorczuk's been on many of these. So these are the true heroes. Again, not just men, women. We've had children who play the role of victims, and they've been extraordinary. Very proud of these individuals. And with the environmental thing, and then I'll close here, it is ecocide. It's a form of genocide. What is happening to the environment of Ukraine because of the ballistics, because of the missiles that are fired, because of the deadly chemicals and metals? This is ecocide. It's intentional bombing of an environment, of our earth, for a destructive manner. And we have to call it like it is. There's the Black Sea. When I go to Odessa, my heart just sinks looking at the beautiful Black Sea. It has just been pummeled with environmental contaminants. Drones. Okay, it was all about drones, and is this an environmental problem? It is, and it was advertised here in the US that Russia leads the way in drone technology, but you can see Ukraine has retaliated. But what happens with the drones that don't fire off, that lay in the ground, that contaminate the soil and the waterways, let alone the exploded ordnance, and it's going from both sides as well. So drone strikes use explosive weapons, pollutants, particularly in the populated areas. They contain explosives, they get into our groundwater, it's toxic, and everyone's thinking about the drone and what the mission is, but no one's thinking about what's underneath the drone, the environment, the grass, the farms, the fields. And with the amount of drones that are flying around, and Ukraine's leading the way in technology, we also need to lead the way in environmental cleanup when people are coming back to their homes. So drones have the potential to harm the environment, and they also target industrial plants releasing chemicals. They go after military bases, releasing hydrocarbons, fuels. So with drone technology, it's a way that Ukraine is turning this war around in a brilliant fashion, and with AI, but also there's an environmental cost. You have to defend yourself, but you also have to think of not evacuating, but is it safe to go back? Is it safe to go back to your small village in Donbass when there's asbestos, hydrocarbons, mercury, arsenic, lead? No one talks about the safety of going back and living in your village. And what I've learned from Ukrainians, they want to go back home. They don't want to internally migrate. They don't want to go to another country. They want to be in their village. They want to be with their family. Unexploded ordnances, the mines, again, heavy metals. Just for the sake of time, I'll finish up here. If you're really into this, there's TNT, there's HMX, there's RDX, but these unexploded ordnances are very important because 27% of Ukraine now is covered with mines. Some exploded, some not. It's going to take decades to clean this up, and many of the Ukrainian colleagues we have who have lost their jobs because of lost funding are now in the demining business. And this is going to be a big deal. They're still cleaning up mines from the Vietnam War in Cambodia, Vietnam. Just think what it's going to be like in East Ukraine, cleaning up the minefields. 27% unexploded ordnances. This is going to be a real issue as we build Ukraine. So, Slava Ukraini, I'm very proud to be a part of this. I will say that my place was right on Walton and Oakley, and during the lunch break and network, if you don't see me, I'm back there. I'm looking around the old house where our kids grew up, and thank you for the good work. And Maria, thank you. We'll open it up for questions if we have time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hryhorczuk and Dr. Erickson. I think we see the impact not only on Ukraine, but globally on the world, what this war is doing. Several questions similar to what you had just mentioned, ecocide. Can this be considered war crime? Is Russia a terrorist state?
So ecocide is a crime against the environment. And in wartime situations, it's covered under both international humanitarian law with the Geneva Convention of the 1977 amendments, and under international human rights law with the Rome Statutes and the International Criminal Court. However, if you look at the definition of ecocide under these statutes, it has to be widespread, severe, and long-term damage, which this is. But the caveat is that the damage caused is out of proportion to the military gain. So think about that. Anyone can claim, well, I blew up that dam because it was to our military gain to do that. So judges will someday have to decide what you did. For example, when you blew up that dam, just because you didn't want Ukrainian soldiers to cross the river, and you flooded 77 settlements and deprived hundreds of areas of water and irrigation. Is that a war crime? I think it is a war crime. So I think that eventually Russia will be judged for many war crimes, for kidnapping children, but also for the ecocide that they're doing. Historically, I don't think any country has ever been tried or any individual convicted under these statutes, with the exception of Iraq during the Gulf War, and they're blowing up the oil wells and stuff. It's a very hard thing to enforce, but I think that with Russia's war in Ukraine, I think we'll finally enforce it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question only. Dr. Erickson, have you collaborated with US, NATO, CBRNE, and is it going to make any effect on NATO doctrines?
I think so. We have. NATO's been a good partner, and we're going to continue that partnership. Part of CBRN training, trauma training, is to make sure it's consistent and not just done by different factions. It needs to be uniform. So yes, we want to continue working closely with NATO. And I'll tell you this, with our Advanced Trauma Life Support, ATLS, it's from the granted certification by the American College of Surgeons. And they told us we cannot give anyone ATLS certification if they're in Ukraine, because you're teaching the courses on Ukrainian soil. And we said, but you don't understand. These are the experts. They're in the middle of the war. They're teaching us how to do trauma. And with a lot of going back and forth, Ukraine became the first non-US site to grant ATLS certification. So the trauma surgeons coming out of Ukraine and the CBRN experts coming out of Ukraine are the best in the world right now. And we will also embrace that along with NATO to make sure there's structure and the delivery. And Ukrainians will soon be teaching other countries. When we win this war and when we move on, we will need Ukrainians to teach the world how to handle conflict and to move on despite great adversaries.
Thank you very much for an enlightening, disheartening a little, but also impressive that Ukraine is ending up teaching us how to do it, because unfortunately they are there in the middle of it.